All right. Is there anybody here who was ever promised a gift for Christmas and you believed that you were going to get that gift as soon as you got that promise? Anybody like that? Okay. And now, that promise that you had received about that gift didn't change your behavior. Because when your mother or your father said, look, if you keep acting like that, you can forget about getting that thing for Christmas. Did you kind of straighten up a little bit, just enough, in order to make sure you got the promise? All right, so that promise influenced how you felt. Then came Christmas morning, and when you opened your gift and you saw that promise, it was like, yes, that promise had become a reality. Now, in the Bible, you will hear people talking about the promised land. You ever heard somebody say the promised land? All right. God gave Abraham and Sarah a promise. He promised them that their descendants, or their children, great-grandchildren way down there, were going to receive this beautiful section of a country that would be wonderful for living. The grass was going to be green. The land was going to produce a lot of food and crops. There'd be plenty of water to drink, plenty of water for the animals, plenty of land to graze and eat fruit. The fruit was going to be bigger than anything you had ever seen. The grapes would be luscious, more plentiful than anything you could imagine. Those of you who love to eat, you would have enjoyed being in the promised land. And not only that, they were going to be a free people, free to make their own laws, free to worship God as they please. Now, this promised land was located in the area called Canaan. So sometimes people talk about going to the land of Canaan. That's why we sing songs about Canaan, because Canaan and the promised land were the same thing. Now, there was one catch in God's promise. God told them that before your people get this promised land, they were going to be slaves in Egypt for 430 years. That's the amount of time they would spend in Africa. So while they were going through the midst of their trials and the midst of their struggles, and while they were slaves, what kept them going was they had a vision of a promised land where one day they were going to be free. Now, every one of us here, we live our lives based on the promised land that we are looking forward to. Now, if I just had a whole bunch of money in my pocket and I pulled it out and I gave each one of you $10,000, that's probably all the time some of y'all would shout amen in church. But if I gave you, Mike, you would really get your 15 minutes of praise in. If I gave each one of you $10,000, come next Sunday, some of you would already be broke. You would have took that money and went to the mall and you would have just went crazy. Some of you would have took that same $10,000 and saw it as an investment for your education. Some of you would have taken that same $10,000 and started a business with it. And you would have turned that $10,000 into $100,000 or more. How you spent that money all depends on what you think is the real promised land for your life. Now, Martin Luther King Day is not simply about a single man. It is about a struggle of black people for nearly 400 years in existence in this country. Now, when I was born some 50 years ago, people were murdered because they tried to move into a white neighborhood. They were killed simply because they wanted to integrate schools. Churches were burned, they were bombed because they encouraged people to get out and vote. Black men, they disappear in the country. Some of them would be lynched. You'd never hear from them again. Black women would be raped, and sometimes, even though they knew who the rapists were, nobody even got arrested. There were very few blacks in any of the major league sports. I think it was either Jet or Ebony. They would post each month who was in what major league sport. And it didn't take a lot of pages in order to see who was there. The only time we got jobs in the banks was when we were the janitors. You know, it's amazing how for years they used to say how we would steal anything we could get, and they would leave us alone with everything in the bank, and they'd go home so we could clean it up. We all lived, blacks were considered inferior in just about every way you can imagine. We were second-class citizens in our own country. And we as black folk, we all lived together, we all worked together, we all went to school together. Wasn't because we all loved each other, it's because we didn't have no other option but to do that. Amen? And then Dr. King came along and he gave us a dream of what could be for the races. And that speech was given in 1963. But it didn't change anything after the speech was over. We all shouted and said amen, but the work still needed to be done. There was still blood that was going to be shed. There were still battles to be fought. There were still places to be burned down. There were still people who had to go to jail. There was still a whole lot of abuse and humiliation before this nation would even consider the dream. Now, what motivated us to keep fighting was the belief that there was a promised land involved in all of this. As Billy said, when Dr. King said, I've climbed the mountain, I have seen the promised land. And that promised land was a place that we as a people would be in charge of our own destiny. We would soar in our education levels. We would live where we wanted to live. We would compete in whatever sport we wanted to compete in. We would be lifted out of poverty and have a much higher standard of living. We would be second to nobody and would be able to stand toe-to-toe with any race, any color, or any creed of people. Now, in our Old Testament reading today, we found that Moses wanted to see the promised land because Moses was going to die before the people got into it. So God allowed Moses to go up to the top of Mount Pisgah. Now, when you see a church named Mount Pisgah, you're like, what are these people talking about? They're talking about the mountain that Moses went up to the top of in order to look and see the promised land. From the mountaintop, he could get the big picture of what God intended to do for his people, and Moses said, this thing is absolutely wonderful. So when Dr. King said in his speech, I've been to the mountaintop, he was simply paraphrasing what Moses had said there in Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy, Moses, he actually saw land for the promised land, whereas Dr. King saw the promised land in terms of a new way of living, a new way of relating to one another, a new way of living in society. Now, if you could go and find Dr. King and bring him back today and ask him about the vision of the promised land, he would probably be shocked to see the promised land he saw and the promised land that we live in. Amen? Now let me be the first to acknowledge that God has brought us a whole long mighty ways since I was born 50 years ago. Amen? We can vote. We can be elected. We can attend the schools of our choice. We can live wherever we want to live. We can sit anywhere on the bus, though most of us still sit in the back. We can play professional sports. We can be on TV. We can have high-paying jobs. We can do things that our grandparents only dreamed about doing. Amen?
Hi, thank you for watching our video. If you'd like to watch this message in its entirety, please visit us at our website, www.glenvillenewlife.com. And thanks again for watching.